Hello everybody, as you probably already know, my name is Catherine Evans, and today I'll be talking about a project that I've been working on for both my honors in my undergrad and my master's, and that's what I'm currently doing. I've been working on this for a few years with my supervisor, Paul Hill, and the talk I'll be giving today is called Stratification and the Timing of Maxima Using Remotely Sensed Surface Reflectance in Tidal Seas in South Korea. So a little bit of an overview into the theory behind my project. We know that suspended sediment can change the color of surface waters. This satellite image of my study area is a pretty good example where some areas have a lot of suspended sediment at the surface, and as a result looks much more red than these bluer areas which would have less suspended sediment at the surface. We also know an increased current velocity can raise the concentration of suspended sediment in the water column. Essentially, the faster a current is moving, the more sediment it's able to suspend. Our project is trying to understand the phase lag of suspended sediment reaching the water surface in areas of localized sediment stratification. Essentially, that's why we think there's this banded pattern here. We think there's stratification happening in areas of my study region, which is in the Hooks and Mudbelt. So the Hooks and Mudbelt, this is what I'm studying. This is an area off of the southwest coast of South Korea. My study area is in these red rectangles in each of these maps, and it's in a pretty it's in a macrotidal area. There's large tides over 4 meters in some cases. It also has semi-diurnal tides, which means 2 tides per day. There's a lot of muds and silts, lots of sediment that's able to be suspended because it's very loose on the seafloor. And there's peak tidal flows of 1.5 meters per second. So there's a lot of water moving very quickly in this area. So beyond the actual suspended sediment that's in the area, there's also this series of tidal ridges and channels. So we can see the Hooks and Mudbelt kind of goes through these islands here. I'm studying here. And there's a series of tidal ridges and channels that kind of move through the islands off the coast of Southwest Korea. And we think that these channels and ridges have a lot of importance into what we're studying. So our project is done through a combination of fieldwork. My supervisor, Paul Hill, as well as another member on my committee, Tim Milligan, who's in this photo here, have taken time series of suspended sediment during a tidal cycle. We've also used some modeling to be able to predict the phase lag of suspended sediment rising to the surface, depending on tidal currents. And what I'm focused on is the remote sensing aspect of the project. I've been using Landsat 8, which I used in my honors, as well as the GOSI, or otherwise known as the Geostationary Ocean Color Imager, for what I'm currently working on in my master's. Now, the initial hypothesis that we had was that the banded pattern that we can see here in these images matches the bathymetry. As we can see in this image here, this is another Landsat image. The areas where there's a lot more shallow, the shallower areas on the map have higher levels of suspended sediment. This is a Landsat image that's showing the red wavelength, or band 4 in the satellite. And over the ridges, there tends to be more suspended sediment at the surface that the satellite can catch with its camera than over the deeper channels. We believe that the tidal currents are actually creating a ludicline, or a density gradient, in the channels, and that this stratification that's happening when the tidal current is moving quickly causes a delay in the rise of suspended sediment on the scale of hours. Now, in the field, Paul and Tim were actually able to find some pretty promising results that really support this hypothesis. So I'm going to be focusing on this 2017 data that they got, which are these blue lines here, with this light blue line representing high slack water, so high tide, and this darker line representing the concentration of suspended sediment at peak flow times. And we can see at high slack water, there's a pretty level amount of suspended sediment throughout the water column, but when we're at a peak flow stage, when the water's moving really quickly, there's actually a huge amount of suspended sediment being picked up. But because of this stratification, this ludicline that's developing, there's actually a limit to the amount of suspended sediment that's getting to the surface. And we think that with satellite imagery, we're able to find this difference and this delay in the rise of suspended sediment to the surface in the channels. So for my honors, I used the Landsat 8 satellite, and I used Landsat 8 imagery. Landsat 8 has a few advantages. The first is that it has a pretty fine resolution for something that's so publicly available. It's 30 by 30 meters, and it creates these really dramatic photos as a result. But one of the bigger disadvantages is that there's a 16-day flyover period, so it's really only passing over your study area once every 2 weeks or so. And the day might be cloudy, the day might be clear, so you're really just hoping for as many clear days as possible. Landsat 8 has 8 spectral bands. I used band 4 in my honors, which is what we would be seeing as red, and that's what these black and white images have been showing. Now, in my honors, I found some pretty promising results that seem to correlate pretty well with our hypothesis. The first was that there's definitely lower reflectance over the channels than over the ridges. We can see this here. Mean reflectance between all the images I could gather was lower in deeper areas. It matches with imagery fairly well. The other pretty interesting result when comparing depth against reflectance in this box plot here was that there's also a pretty dramatic drop in the level of reflectance once you get to about 20 meters in depth. Now, Paul and Tim's field data actually showed that ludiclines were developing at 20 meters in depth. So the fact that there's also a drop in the amount of suspended sediment at the surface at 20 meters in depth seems to support this hypothesis that there's stratification happening in the channels of the Hooks and Mudbelt, and that we can identify it with our satellites. Now for my master's, I've been expanding this data to GOSI, the Geostationary Ocean Color Imager. This is the first geostationary imager worldwide, and it's been running since 2010, so it has a lot of data. Every day it captures 8 images on the hour from 9 a.m. until 4 p.m. Now it's on board the COMS satellite, and here we have a pretty cool image just kind of showing what the series of images might look like in a day. And you can even see there's some mud really moving around in this image, which is what I'm studying. So I'm just going to walk you through some of the maps and the trends that we've been finding so far, and after that I'll tell you what I'm planning on doing next. So here we have another bathymetric map. We're showing the ridges and the channels, and much like what we saw with Landsat, there definitely does seem to be higher levels of reflectance over the ridges than over the channels. This is taken just for one day, so this is September 8th, 2015. Now, the advantage of having hourly images like with the GOSI satellite is that we can also relate these images, and this is showing the maximum reflectance from all 8 images in a day. So whatever image had the highest reflectance at this point would be demonstrated in this map. Is that we can actually relate the images and the timing captured of these images to what's happening in the tidal cycle at that point. So this is a graph demonstrating the water level, or essentially what's going on with the tide at that point. And I've correlated the hours from high tide here and just kind of shown where they are on this graph here. Now, we're seeing some pretty cool results with just this day, where channels definitely seem to be having their peak reflectance at or around high tide, which means whatever was going on during peak flow here doesn't seem to be bringing a lot of suspended sediment to the surface, which is what we would expect. Instead, it's when there's not much of a current running, when there wouldn't be able to be stratification, that a lot of suspended sediment is at the surface. On the other hand, ridges have a much higher level of reflectance, either when the water level is at its lowest point, which makes sense because there's a higher concentration of suspended sediment in less of an area, but also during peak flow, because there wouldn't be the space for stratification to be developing at these depths. Now, I just have a couple more slides at this point. This slide is really showing 2 locations, one point over the channel and one point over the ridge for all 83 days that I'm currently studying, and all the images over those days. And we're seeing here what peak reflectance on each of those days where it is in the tidal cycle, so the hours from low tide in this graph. Now, there's definitely a relationship to the water level here. Both the ridge and the channel appear to have a rise in the level of suspended sediment at the surface when there's a lower water level in general. And that's pretty good. Now, there's also a pretty interesting thing going on with the channel, and this is something that I haven't currently expanded my research on, but I think would be very interesting to continue researching, where yes, there's this really dramatic amount of high reflectance samples at low tide, but there's also two kind of secondary patterns here where about 6 hours before low tide, or what would be the previous high tide, and about 6 hours after high tide, there's higher levels of peak reflectance here than in the hours between, which would be when we would be seeing peak flow. So that's just something pretty interesting. I would like to compare it against bathymetry of everything, but right now I think this is a really promising and interesting thing to look into. So for now, what's next? I would like to be comparing bathymetry, tide, and reflectance tests, so bathymetry over the whole area rather than just one location over the channel and over the ridge. I'd also like to look at environmental data. So currently I'm bringing in some wind data, I'm bringing in precipitation, I'll be looking at whatever else I can think of as well. And with all this data I'll be bringing in, I'll start some exploratory data analysis. And that's it for now. I'd like to thank you all for listening to my talk. And if you have any questions, I would be really happy to answer them. Thank you.